So in your report from August 2024, you identified three challenges to freedom of opinion and expression that come directly from what's happening in Gaza. Can you take me through those three challenges?
Yes. I see in the catastrophic killings that are taking place in Gaza, the conflict, the genocide, whatever you want to call it, an impact, a global impact. Gaza, what is happening in Gaza, is not only restricted in that territory or even in that region. And in terms of the global impact, I see media freedom being threatened, the safety of journalists in Gaza itself. Foreign media, international media has not been allowed in since the 7th of October 2023. That is unprecedented in any conflict around the world. We see a very high level of killing of journalists, which of course has a chilling effect on others. But we have to remember that these are local journalists who are being killed because they are the ones on the ground. So the price that they are paying, both as Gazans and as journalists, is simply too high. And that has an effect on reporting around the world, on the dependence or reliance on social media, which has enabled people to express themselves, but also spread a lot of disinformation, misinformation, a lot of hate speech, harmful speech, and disproportionately restricted Palestinian speech as compared to non-Palestinian. So there is that impact on media freedom, social media or traditional media. There is also an impact on the right to protest around the world, freedom of expression, solidarity for Palestinian rights. We have seen in Western countries, whether it's Canada or the US or European countries, the authorities actually undermining their own well-established, long-standing rules about protests being disrupted, being applied disproportionately again against those who are supporting the Palestinian cause. We see very disruptive, very violent attacks on student protesters on campus. I've had professors, researchers, well-known scholars writing to me about the kind of pressure that they are coming in when they try to look at the situation in the Palestinian occupied territories. Same thing happening with artists, with galleries refusing, for example, to present exhibits of artists if they pronounce themselves in one way or the other on the situation in Gaza. So restriction, freedom of expression around the world, particularly in Western democracies, has been set back by what has been happening there. Thirdly, my third point is actually how there is a confusion between speech that is protected by international law and speech that is prohibited by international law. If I can simplify it, it basically means speech, criticism of a country is very permissible. Political speech is very highly protected by international law, is permitted by international law. On the other hand, international law prohibits advocacy of hatred that can lead to incitement of violence. Anti-Semitism, for example, would be restricted under international law, but the way in which anti-Semitism is being interpreted as criticism of Israel's policies rather than the expression of hatred against the Jewish people means that a lot of legitimate political expression against what the Israeli government is doing, against the policies and practices of the Israeli state, has now suddenly been labeled as anti-Semitism and is being used to arrest or censor or silence pro-Palestinian speakers. So in these three ways, abusing the concept of anti-Semitism, attacking media freedom, and suppressing protests against Israel and protests that support Palestinian rights are three major ways in which what is happening in Gaza is having an impact on freedom of expression.
You pointed to this briefly in your panel today at Wexfo about the hypocrisy that we're seeing, where Western governments, Western democracies, liberal democracies are changing sometimes their own laws to allow for this sort of what I'm calling the Israeli exception when it comes to um, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion. They're actually suppressing their own citizens to almost allow Israel to run roughshod over international human rights law. What are the far-reaching impacts of this, do you think, beyond Gaza?
Well, the free license that Western countries are giving to suppress pro-Palestinian protests, pro-Palestinian speech, the way in which they're protecting criticism against Israel by censoring any criticism against Israel, actually is sending a message around the world that there are double standards, legitimate double standards. They're basically legitimizing double standards in human rights. Now, at the core of human rights is the concept of non-discrimination, of equality, of universal application of rights. That is being undermined by those very states that for the last 75 plus years of the UN's existence have very strongly argued about human rights. These are the human rights champions I'm talking about. They are now rolling back their commitment to human rights when it comes to the Palestinian issue. And that, for me, is hypocrisy, but hypocrisy at a very heavy cost to all of us, because it undermines all our rights. Our governments can turn around and say, well, if there are two standards in the context of Israel, why not for us as well?
You mentioned that you also looked at Canada in your report. What did you find there?
I found in Canada the same inclination to restrict pro-Palestinian support. I found reports that what I am wearing here, this scarf, is not permitted apparently in Parliament House in Canada. I found complaints, people writing to me saying that they were blocked, they were stopped. I found student protests that were suppressed. I found actually even Jewish groups writing to me from Canada saying they do not support what Israel is doing in Gaza. They want to protest, but they are being blocked or disrupted in various ways.
What has Israel's response been to your report?
Well, very interesting. You know, I presented my report to the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly, which is made up of all the member states of the UN. Usually a wide range of members are present in the room when I present my report. When I presented this one last October, there were many countries from the developing world, there were many countries from the West. The US was the first to take the floor, for example, but Israel was not present in the room. They chose not to engage with me, perhaps because they disagree with me, but perhaps also because they were afraid that I would come back and we would actually have a discussion about how Israel is behaving in the Gaza area, in the conflict, and also in the West Bank, by the way, in relation to freedom of expression.
Israel has changed its own laws also since
yes.
this on freedom, and really clamped down.
Yes, yes.
What have you seen there?
Well, in my report, I actually talk about how Israel is actually restricting the freedom of expression of the Israeli people. Their right, they have a human right to access diverse sources of media, for example, but the ban the law that was introduced and used exclusively to ban Al Jazeera in Israel and also close down their office in the West Bank and so on, those kinds of laws are damaging the rights of Israeli people. There have been a lot of incidents and cases where there is a kind of censorship now being applied by Israel on Israeli media reporting on Gaza. So within Israel, as a democratic state, Israel can no longer claim to be a fully democratic state if these are the kinds of policies it is introducing now. So the conflict, the catastrophic killings that the Israeli Defense Force are committing across in the occupied territories is actually also undermining Israel's own laws, its own constitution, its own democracy.